Let's get to the good part. First of all, I would like to start with some clarity and mutually agreed on terms. Shoot. What will we define as better when comparing the economic systems like capitalism or socialism? Socialism, in the Marxist sense, being the lower phase of communism. Personally, when comparing economic systems and nations, I look at the physical quality of life, i.e., caloric intake, birth mortality, access to healthcare, housing, etc., between equally developed nations in order to compare, scientifically speaking, modes for managing the economy. Would you say that's fair? Well, I'd add on protection of liberty as a category by which societies ought to be ranked. Alright, though we're comparing economic systems. What would you define as liberty? Liberty is the ability of one to make decisions freely. I'd argue it's a part of quality of life. As well, since both economic systems shape the societies they are within to very large degrees, I don't think it's unfair to consider things of this sort. That's fair? Forgive me if my words come out jumbled. Yeah, I gotta be as clear as possible. Fair? Yeah. Also, keep to the economic systems. I should also stress that we should keep to the economic systems themselves and compare things according to what we've established. Fair? Naturally. Alright. As you know, I'm a socialist, nationalist in my roles. I believe that capitalism, being the private ownership of production in the economy with wage labor, surplus value extraction, etc., is, in the grand scheme of history, a positive development in human society. Capitalism, especially in Western countries, has done quite a lot of industrialization and has grown economies. As a Marxist in my economic observations and beliefs, however, I believe that capitalism is an outdated mode of production, one that, with the advent of socialism, the public, collective, or cooperative ownership of the means of production for the needs of society, as an economic system, has made capitalism, especially in its global state today with advents like the EU and NAFTA, a less than desirable system. Rather, when we compare equally developed socialist economies with equally developed capitalist ones, we see that roughly 90% of the socialist ones do better in physical life than their capitalist counterparts. Higher caloric intake, better healthcare, etc. I would also say that under the height of socialism, liberty, being the ability for one to make his own decisions, was also protected to quite an extent. Since, according to American and British workers who lived in the USSR and other socialist states, they had quite a bit of say in their workplaces, and they chose who managed them. I'm incredibly curious as to exactly which socialist economies from those statistics are coming from, if you're aware. I'm more than happy to give you studies done with World Bank information if you'd like. Absolutely. As for the last bit of your statement there, though, I have my suspicions that foreign workers likely had more choice than most. Actually, around what era would you approximate that information came from? For the workers? Yeah. 1930s, 1940s, and I think a few cases in the early 50s. I can find the individual cases as well. Lenin's USSR was more free than what would come later, but ultimately had to dial back its ambitions a fair bit to even afford to be, and Stalin's was, of course, not. Lenin died in 24, and Stalin started the 5-year plans in 29, so I particularly go into Stalin's USSR, of course, with records and testimony and such. So we arrive at the 5-year plans then. I think it's hard to argue that they were beneficial to quality of life. When we look at the product of the 5-year plans, undoubtedly they raised the physical quality of life as their goals were met. Of course, with how underdeveloped the USSR was when it started, it's known and admitted there were difficulties. However, the USSR industrial growth rate, GDP, and expansion of literacy, health services, etc. were pretty unprecedented. Again, I'm more than happy to back this up. Also, we might have to go back to the philosophy of the system since I'm looking at the general chat and they're complaining. LOL. I'm willing. Kind of felt like I never got my shot there anyways. Try to keep to the theoretical. Alright. Ignoring the discussion about the USSR, I've DM'd you a few studies about the PQL comparisons. Count. Okay. So, one thing I noticed is that it says socialism over communism, which makes me wonder, is it counting, say, Sweden or something? No. I've looked through it. mainly the Marxist-style countries like USSR, Romania, around 160 countries, I believe. When I say socialism, I mean lower phase communism, not places like Denmark or Sweden. I figured as much. I was wondering about the studies. If I were to say that socialism is typically followed closely behind by tyranny, would you dispute that? And if so, how? Is tyranny the opposite of liberty? I'd say so. Most human beings will use power when given it, and the ones that wouldn't don't have an interest in being a tyrant. I would dispute that they're closely followed by tyranny, especially if we're talking about the economic systems themselves. Socialism, and for that matter communism, operates under democratic principles that, especially in late-stage communism, you are allowed leisure and to follow your passions as much as possible while maintaining the society's wealth and position. Marx is quoted in saying this about communism. In communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. Maybe that's what Marx envisions. But not only is that not true in practice, I have a hard time believing that a dictatorial phase could just end like that without a gigantic political upheaval. Socialism is much the same, however. I would say it's much more about running a society based on workplace democracy and common ownership, where you are provided for in the fruits of your own labor. Well, if we're speaking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, then we should have some context. The DOTP is a class term, as opposed to the dictatorship of the bourgeois. It means that the interests and will of one class, seeing as there are only two classes in this example, are paramount in government. In capitalism, it's for the capitalists. In socialism, it's for the workers. It's not an actual dictatorship, is what I'm getting at. It sounded like you were implying there would be a period of despotism that would pass. Oh, I didn't mean to imply that. My apologies. Well, I don't buy this idea that the capitalists have this absolute power. They're beholden to the court of public opinion, the actual courts, bear in mind I'm not an ANCAP, and the consumer, who is also their employee. Marx's notion of a capitalist class that controls all comes from the fact that he lived in a time where that was about as close to being true as it ever would be. But has it aged well? As well, the government working for the working class sounds great, but I'm of the opinion the government will always work for itself first and foremost, in some way or another. I'll wait for you to finish. I was moving on to another thought, actually, but let me see if I've got anything to add on to this. It's honestly difficult to envision a system where the people with the most influence in government aren't those who are the most ambitious and the most clever. You can go ahead. Okay. Well, as a class, and I think we see this today with how much lobbying and bought politicians there are in the U.S., they hold the most economic influence. There's always a conflict between the working class and the capitalist. Mainly in this conflict that branches out into different things. A capitalist wants to ensure he makes the most profit, has the most bought product, and that he doesn't have to spend much on wages, maintenance, etc. A worker wants the highest wage, so he can buy things that he needs and he wants, like food, rent, entertainment, etc. And he conflicts with the capitalists in this system. There are periods where this conflict is less and more, but it's always still there. While there aren't death squads for companies, that I know of, in America, like there was during the construction of railroads, they still hold the most influence over the state. The state itself is a tool of one class against the other, a vehicle of class struggle, and a manifestation of it. We see this with the too big to fail companies that can go on with impunity, outsourcing, use less than acceptable means of acquiring labor and capital, big corporations stamping out small towns' economies, etc. They are, to some extent, bound by what you said as well. Though, to what extent? I'll address some other things. Hold on. Should I respond to what's there? You can if you want, but I'll be writing too. As well, the government working for the working class sounds great, but I'm of the opinion the government will always work for itself first and foremost in some way or another. The government today is filled and bought with capitalists. Excuse me. In my opinion, if a government was held accountable to the people via a republic or a democracy, rather than have money inside of it, then it would be far better of a tool. The government is held accountable to the people through the republic. If a corporation becomes powerful enough to legitimately, utterly stifle democracy, then it's gone beyond where my libertarian leanings end. I don't believe that America, nor just about any first world government, has reached such a point. The American system still ultimately ebbs and flows with our social tides, even if there are bumps. As for capitalists having such a role in government, you should see what I said at the very end of my last lengthy series of posts. The most ambitious and clever people will often have major roles in government, one way or another. The discussion here is really whether or not that's the first person to exploit the hole left for this sort of person to fill, by your idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat, or people who have established brands and reputations, both of which are constantly in the court of public opinion, and fall under scrutiny by all kinds of people. Neither is a perfect world, the latter is better. Also, I stand by my belief that the state primarily wants to perpetuate itself. Recall my previous statement on human beings and power. When they work with big business or the worker, it's because one or the other has the tools to perpetuate them at the time. There are some regulations in place, but ultimately the current government is working against the interests of its people. We can look at the war on drugs, the war on terror, all the different scandals about the CIA buying cocaine to sell in American markets and in other places as well. Companies like Coca-Cola do have death squads to kill working union leaders. As for capitalists have a role in government, they should see what lengthy series of posts, most ambitious and clever people. This is true to an extent, and to the extent I agree with you, and to that extent I agree with you. However, the primary role of government should be to bring the best quality of life possible to its citizens, and to protect their interests, in my opinion. Rather than seeing the way that's worded, it makes it sound like he's saying that all people should protect things in his opinion, as opposed to that being his opinion. Anyway, and to protect their interests, in my opinion. Rather than seeing the state as an entity within itself, we should look at the state as an entity that is a neutral. It fulfills the interests of whoever's inside of it. The discussion here is really whether or not that's the first person to exploit the hole for this sort of person to fill by your idea of a dictatorship or the proletariat, both of law, which are consistently in the court of public opinion and fall under scrutiny by all kinds of people. A lot of people who are in the capitalist class aren't accountable for their decisions. An example would be Flint, Michigan, which was under the administration of a pro-business libertarian, if I'm not mistaken. In socialism, the crisis wouldn't have happened in the first place, because the working people never would have voted to get their water from a source which was dangerous to them, and rather likely would have voted to clean up the dirty river and keeping the clean water source. Public opinions play a factor, of course, but with the arm of the state, which I think we both agree serves the interest of whoever is in power, they don't necessarily have to. Take Amazon getting tax breaks and making profits just from that. Tax havens being left alone, etc., while again outsourcing to the expense of the American worker. The main question when it comes to economics, however, I think, is which would you want to live with? My mind is breaking down. A democratically organized workplace with your coworkers, where the fruits of your labor go into society for your own benefit, or the other, where you theoretically could rise up, but the vast majority don't. And, of course, the continuation of class conflict leads back to where we started, which is the decision. I would also press to go forward towards why capitalism is exploitative as well. Why don't they? I have no issues with unions conceptually, though many of the American unions are themselves corrupt to the core. And I don't even so much have an issue with strikes, two useful ways to bite back at big business without the involvement of a nanny state. One of a few issues with this democratic workplace idea is that it leaves so many questions unanswered. How is it for my own benefit? How would my labor be distributed, and how would I be compensated for it? I don't support Coca-Cola death squads, never have, never will. However, though I hate to whataboutism, socialist states are infamous for their violent suppression of ideology falling outside of a certain paradigm. There's a little moral high ground to be won here. The wars on drugs and terror were both to large degrees gambits for power and influence by those in office. Your assumption is that the proletariat that managed to enter the state will remain loyal to their fellow workers on the ground. I'm not inclined to think so. Pointing out the crisis in Flint is rather silly to me, as the politicians responsible were themselves elected, of course. They have since been lambasted by a large part of the court of public opinion, and to suggest crises of resources in various forms do not happen under socialism, and especially communism, caused by their very doctrines, would be utterly disingenuous, though I don't assume you're saying anything of the sort. One of the few issues with the democratic workplace is that it leaves so many questions unanswered, etc. It works in your benefit in a few ways, those being, you have a say in how your workplace is run rather than a top-down structure. You get to decide, along with your fellow workers, how the value of your labor is used to benefit everyone who has a stake in it. I'll actually go into this before I address the others. Forgive me for copy-paste because I just had this conversation last night and I feel it's fitting. Let's say in capitalist society we are co-workers and we work in a factory that makes steel plates. Each steel plate is worth about $5. For sake of this example, and our hourly wage is $10 an hour. I make 10 steel plates. You make 15 in an hour-long shift. The value of what I've produced is $50 worth of steel plates, while yours is $75. Yet, in this example, we're both paid as if we produced the same amount. Meanwhile, that's one of the weird things about fucking garbage. Our boss gets the $105 and the rest of the value. Since it has to be sold, he can also sell the plates at a higher price than its actual value. Let's assume it's just sold at base value. Our boss takes $105 and spends it on maintenance, costs, taxes, etc. And when he pays it all, he has $70, for example. What? He has $70, for example. Our boss didn't help us make the steel. He just used the value created by our labor to buy more steel and build up his business, while we keep a fraction of the value of our labor. In socialism, instead of going to your boss, the value you create is either you get to decide what to do with it, or it goes to the betterment of society, the reaching of goals higher than yourself, so that your life, and along with all the other lives like your co-workers and families, are better. Your workplace isn't a top-down structure, and rather is a horizontal one, or it has a democratically elected manager that is recalled either whenever you and your co-workers want, or after a limit. This is also a simplified explanation of exploitation. So there's no level of skill in doing anything that the boss might do? Nothing worthy of a fair amount of compensation all his own? There's a reason business management is something people study, sometimes for a very long time. It's a skill, and a valuable one. The truth of things is that the value of labor isn't determined in a vacuum, not even by the boss. It's determined by the forces of the market, supply and demand. Bosses are just usually the best at reading these factors. That, or they won't be the boss of much for very long. There's one other big issue. What if I decide it'd be cool to start a factory and I don't want it to be run this way? There's only really one answer to the predicament under socialism: force. Furthermore, is the fact that I decided it would be cool to start a factory worth nothing. So there's no level of skill in doing anything the boss might do. Nothing worthy of a fair amount of compensation all his own. Why should the boss be entitled to the profits of the labor that you and I produced? Management is a form of labor, but it isn't the same as physical labor. With this example, why should the CEO and not you and I have the excess profit we create? At the same time, the price of the steel plates could be set at a value higher than what it's worth, gaining more profit for what is essentially nothing more valuable. It's still a steel plate. Nothing that material and makes it more valuable in this example. In the example, I was going for a simple explanation. The explanation still stands even with the laws of the market, which are very predictable but unstable. With other people like Bezos, for example, the very same logic is unmistakable. An average Amazon employee makes $58,578, while Bezos is worth $127 billion. Two equal human beings in what they can produce with their own blood, sweat, and tears, but one is entirely more rich than the other. There's one other big issue. What if I decided it'd be cool to start a factory and I don't want it to be run this way, etc., etc.? Only way is force under socialism. If you start a factory and you yourself produce what you sell, there's nothing stopping you under socialism or communism. If you decide you want to make shoes, it should be by your own hands, and you can reap the value created by it on the basis of its material value. For example, a shoe is more valuable than a strip of leather that could, theoretically, become a shoe. That's a beautiful part of socialism. You control what you produce, rather than having it be sold and you get a wage that isn't reflective of what you yourself made. Value is objective in this, while price is a rough approximation of value, what with how rare something is, how well it was produced, etc., etc. Materially speaking, I can wear a shoe and it keeps my feet safe. A bunch of leather and such does not. I don't believe value is objective. I believe it's highly subjective. Sure, certain things will always be valuable to some degree, but I believe there are a lot of things that derive value from the society around them, and I'm sure you'd find such value utterly worthless, but I don't. Why should the CEO have the excess profit we create? Well, who's the reason we're here in the first place? Why do all the metaphorical gears move in the correct direction? If you want the sum of your profit, do as you suggested, I do, and produce for yourself. It has never been easier. Frankly, that brings us back to Marxism's status as dated, in my view. It's not that hard to be self-employed in the modern day, and in those places where it still is, I imagine change is coming. That, or again, business interests have pushed to a point beyond where my libertarian ideals end. Still, I don't think that socialism is the solution even in those areas. I don't remotely think I could effectively run Amazon. I wouldn't believe you if you said you could. You still seem to be utterly dismissive of management as clearly of less value. I don't buy that. I don't believe value is subjective, I believe it's highly subjective. I'm sure you'd find such value utterly worthless, but I don't. Leather won't protect my feet if I try to wear it like a shoe. In my example, a shoe is objectively more useful, aka valuable, than leather that could potentially become a shoe. The action of making a shoe creates its value. The shoe existing creates a value for someone to have the incentive to want or need it. In different scenarios, the need is less, but it's still a shoe, objectively speaking. According to need, there's objectively valuable things. This honestly confuses me. Low-key SMH. Like, how could you think that way? Why should the CEO have the excess profit we create? Well, who's the reason we're here in the first place? I do, and produce for yourself. It's never been easier. Exactly. Why are we here? We're here to make money for him, not to service ourselves. This is the class dynamic at work. We don't own the means to produce or accumulate capital like factories. We only sell our labor for the benefit of another person who, as we've established before, doesn't act in our interests as working people. I don't remotely think I could effectively run Amazon. I wouldn't believe you if you said you could, is what he's quoting to lead into Bezos doesn't run Amazon on his own, but he gets insane amounts of money from it, regardless of his actual work that he puts into it. A management officer might make $500,000, but that's shaky in itself. Bezos doesn't do it as a one-man army. I would make no claim to being able to run Amazon on my own. Absolute impossibility. Yet Bezos does it. I wonder what the difference is. That's why I believe that the people who work in Amazon should decide democratically on the ground how to run their business, who manages them, and fair wages for fair work. I would also say that capitalism doesn't bring liberty to a healthy conclusion, because if I don't sell my labor, I starve. If I get too big on the market, I get bought out. It's not that I wouldn't want to work, it's that I'm forced to go into this exploitative relationship. I'm not supposed to have an opinion, but let me rephrase then. I don't think I could do what Bezos does, though I'd argue what he does can most definitely be described as running Amazon. Maybe not directly in every individual aspect, but that was never what I meant. Frankly, again, I don't think you could effectively do what Bezos does either. To sell is not to give away. Nobody goes to their day job for pure charity. No system supports people simply not working. If the choice is between working and not, I'd be hard-pressed to find any system that can provide any kind of liberty and survive. As for being forced to enter into wage labor, are you? Again, maybe when Das Kapital was written well over a century ago, there might have been more truth in this statement, but the world just does not look like that anymore. You don't sell things purely for the benefit of someone else. You sell to obtain profit, which you benefit from. Labor is itself beholden to market forces in terms of value. To sell to sell is not to give away. Nobody goes to their day job for... That's not really what I meant. If you were in a situation where you were scammed out of your work, is it still to your benefit? If I'm caught in the loop of selling my labor and being one paycheck away from homelessness, as many Americans are, that's not desirable or really preserving the liberties of someone else. That's just being scammed. This is still relevant today. Not just back when Marx was alive, but today, right now. The capitalist is the ruling class, and the state works in a way that balances between total ANCAP and just tax breaks, loopholes, and such. Politicians are a market to them, in essence. If someone scammed me so I can work for them, then it's still a scam, in my opinion, along with the theft of what I produce. Holy shit, okay, I'm not supposed to have an opinion, I'm just a narrator, but god damn, you're just Columbia, you're just tearing on yourself. Okay. Eris coming in. If we had a time limit, you'd lose, Nibba. How's it a scam? There are ways to improve one's situation, and yes, some of them include direct work or consumer action, something I'm sure you're in favor of, but beyond that, there are ways to rise above one's station, and even if there absolutely weren't, which I don't believe, why would full-on socialism be the next logical step? The capitalist is a powerful class, but to call them ruling is highly overdramatic. Their ability to influence politics is limited by everything I've stated before. They're very much in the eyes of the public. We are not ruled by a corporate shadow council. Frankly, frankly, say that the corporations did have this level of nigh absolute power. I'd still prefer that to the totalitarians that attempt to implement socialist policy. Wait, what? I'd still prefer that to the totalitarians that attempting to implement socialist policy produces. Totalitarians that attempting to implement. Okay, I can't read that. SMH. I won't linger on this long because I don't believe their power base is as massive and unchallengeable as you make it out to be. And once again, visiting the hypothetical situation where it is, why is full-on socialism the logical next step? Well, we're talking about the systems themselves, right? When we talk about socialist totalitarianism, it goes straight to real existing socialism. Clarify what you mean briefly. I didn't plan to linger on this long for the reasons stated. I mean the countries that actually tried socialism, like the USSR, by real existing socialism. I don't think the USSR was totalitarian, even in its worst, darkest days. Alright, but I'm not inclined to ignore practice entirely, especially since you brought up Flint. I'd argue it was, but we said we were moving away from history much earlier on. I know, but when we talk about things other than the system's an example, then we would necessarily have to go to history. If that's the area you want to move into, then I'm good for it. Alright, let's talk briefly about it, but then I think we should call this a draw since it's gone on for over 3 hours. I'll send you some stuff. I don't think there are draws, mate. Oh, this boy is reaching. I meant between you and me. Or for Floof and Eris to decide. I don't really care. Hold on. If we can put it to the judge panel, I'm good for that. That would be ideal. But if not, I've got time. There are no draws. As I suspected. That's what I thought. Should I still be holding on, or can I talk? I sent you a few sources about the nature of democracy and rights within the USSR under Stalin, and if you really want a TLDR, I can send you a video which uses them as sources and takes paragraphs from them. It goes on to how, to the best of the ability of the time, the USSR tried its best to preserve rights, liberties, and have a democratic nation. Okay, well, you're not off to a fantastic start here. Considering the USSR was a one-party system that squashed any and all political speak, falling outside of very specific parameters, that's, of course not... Wait, what? Considering the USSR was one party, that it's a very specific parameters. That is, of course, not to mention punitive famines or utterly back-breaking and mind-shattering quotas. I hope the Great Purge needs no mention here, and eradication of everyone Stalin perceived as a potential rival. Socialist societies come in two varieties, incredibly short-lived or incredibly repressive. The infamous story of Stalin's death should provide yet more framing for the alleged liberty within his USSR. I'll respond to this. Hold on. Okay, fantastic stuff, all the way to mind-shattering quotas. The books I've given you go into the political system of the USSR. You didn't need to be a member of the party to gain political power. Honestly, personally, I don't understand why there is a system of political power in perfect socialism. There should be no political power. Everyone should have equal power, ? Okay, back to the thing. The books I've given you go into the political system of the USSR. You didn't need to be a member of the party to gain political power. I'll also give you the video which quotes the books directly. Typing more, hold on. Didn't you? Maybe if you were ruthless enough to be worthwhile to Stalin. Either way, you're working for the party's interests and toting their talking points. No, it was just anyone who got votes. Being a member of the party came with its own responsibilities and duties. Can I address the rest? That is, of course, not to mention punitive quotas or family mind-shattering quotes. Collectivization of agriculture actually ended the cycle of famines that had plagued Russia before. and after the worst, the 32 to 33 famine. There wasn't a shortage of food that was in peacetime. The Soviet caloric intake in 1950, according to the CIA documents, was around 3,000 calories a day. Holy fuck. Even if I assume at face value that all your authors are being intellectually honest, which believe you and me, I do not. Believe you, me, you, I do not. You were still toting the party line because you didn't. Because if you didn't, you were probably dead by that point. Also, I was referring to the punitive famines. Those famines actually were absolutely intentional on the part of the Kremlin, particularly in the Ukraine. Colombia is not paying attention. He did not see the word punitive, like a Colombian. Whatever the fuck that means. Well, the authors I'm citing are American and British. I don't think they'd have an incentive to make Stalin seem nice. I know, whatever the fuck that emote is, I agree with it. You're a communist. I assume you don't live in Russia. You're a communist? I assume you don't live in Russia? No, though I've talked to a lot of Russians who did live in the USSR, and I also have a few polls of Russians on Stalin and the USSR, in which it's about 50 to 60% who supported it respectively. They could have also been fucking memers. Forgive me if I don't trust those polls. Do the same polling in Estonia. What? The logic is simple. Stalin, for however repressive he was, and he was, still sort of represented when Russia was on the top of the world to many. With some serious rose tint, people can easily become nostalgic for that, despite literally everything. Forgive me if I don't trust those polls, despite literally everything. Again, the things I've said about Stalin are pretty well documented by non-communist sources that I've given you. We can contest what actually happened, but then it goes into a circle of showing different historical documents and narratives. A lot of the repressive things Stalin supposedly did are exaggerated by their own admission. Like the Black Book of Communism with its numbers and accounts, Stalin did things that I think weren't necessary, and that I would never strive to emulate. But with the position that he was in, with the problems he faced, I don't think he was automatically a bad figure. He also gave plenty of contributions to Marxist theory, and brought the USSR out of the abyss when it started. Brought out of the abyss he may have, but the cost was drastic beyond anything I think should be considered utterly acceptable. Repression to the degree that Stalin perpetuated was not acceptable to me, even if I assumed the mainstream accounts of it were somewhat exaggerated. There's one X and two G's, by the way, and exaggerated. Something like a punitive famine as punishment for rebellion. A man doesn't come to power like Stalin did with purely good intentions. Some of what he did may have been eventually necessary to fend off Germany, but Stalin didn't have precognition. He actually had quite poor foresight on that matter. And of course, the USSR never really came out of this phase of repression. When it attempted to, it found out that its subjects, states, had no interest in sticking around. Why might that be? Big thunk. Brought out of the abyss, utterly unacceptable. If we take the archives documented by the NKVD and the KGB, then throughout all of Stalin's leadership, there were about 600,000 executions. You're fucking killing Sorry, Colombia, please. And most of them were Germans, Tsarists and such. Oh, sorry, never mind. Okay, that makes sense then. But kind of still doesn't. The famine that happened in Ukraine is odd. The famine that happened in Ukraine is odd. Mainly for the fact that if it was as punishment, I find it odd that Stalin sent millions of tons of grain to help alleviate the famine. I also have sources of this from non-communists. According to the current Ukrainian government sources as well, kulaks burned crops, slaughtered animals, and overall sabotaged the development of the USSR. As always, I can send the article in Ukrainian. How useful. I actually haven't, unless the other guy just happens to know Ukrainian, question mark. I actually have an infographic about the referendum for the dissolution of the USSR, which was undemocratic. The archives were declassified documents, by the way. The Eastern Bloc was falling apart before dissolution, and it was falling apart by people's revolt. What if all the kulaks did all of that? They were being told by an invasive power how their lives would be run. There may have not been direct executions, but most of us here wouldn't survive a decade in a work camp Siberia. The Holodomor was either a punitive famine or utterly Soviet incompetence. It was perpetuated by grain requisitions by the state, and whatever aid sent was utterly insufficient and likely a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of grain seized and exported. The stuff was not redistributed. It was, as I said, exported at the expense of the Ukrainians who went without. Isn't that capitalism? The Eastern Bloc was falling apart before dissolution, and was falling by people's revolt. He quotes, "After Stalin, the USSR degenerated further and further into capitalism. Same thing with the Eastern Bloc. Like how he's seen, okay? Wink. Along with the actions of Khrushchev and Brezhnev, like invading Czechoslovakia and Hungary. The fall of the Eastern Bloc was likely to happen by Gorbachev. What if the kulaks did all that? They were being told by an invasive power how their lives would be run." He quotes, "Kulaks were angry that prices were too low. So they decided to sabotage the whole thing at the expense of everyone else, which led to many, many deaths. There may have not been direct executions, but most of you wouldn't survive a day more in Camp Siberia." He quotes, "According to the same declassified documents, about 3 million people were in the gulags throughout the whole of Stalin's leadership, and it peaked at 1.2 million just after World War II, and the majority of people who went into it came out alive. The grain that Stalin sent was comparable to the grain that was exported. But Stalin needed to continue industrialization to get industrial material from Western countries. The UK and others would only take grain and had a gold and precious mineral embargo on the USSR since the early 20s. It's either fail to industrialize and make the West see you as a failure, or take the risk. Failure means invasion, as Stalin said, and he was right, even with the Germans and industrialization. It's either fail to industrialize and make the West see you as a failure or take the risk." He quotes, "No cost is too high to make a communist system almost seem like it could work, huh? If everything Stalin did, both the things you deny and the things you don't, were necessary for the continuation of the system, why the fuck should it continue? Capitalism was introduced sparingly, and when it was done because it was deemed absolutely necessary. They were still being told by an invasive power how their lives would be run. I want to double down on this point I was making. Is all of this really worth it for your system? No cost is too high to make it for the could make communist system seem like it could work, huh?" He quotes. That's not what I'm saying. If you look at what I said afterwards, failure means invasion. Capitalist countries wanted the USSR to fail. The only reason this happened, that's because they were fucking... sorry to curse. I didn't... bad habit. Interjection here. The reason people wanted to stop USSR... Actually, this is on the side of communism right here. It was so... maybe neither side, actually. It was so... the workers of all the surrounding countries saw it as such a benefit to their life. But the politicians in those areas wanted to prevent, obviously, their country from being taken. So honestly, that doesn't give any leeway to either side. So, never mind. The only reason this happened was because Russia was so underdeveloped from the Tsar. Socialism in Russia was such a massive undertaking to establish because of how poor Russia was. Marx thought capitalist countries would go socialist, and Russia was almost the exception to that at the time. Russia would have been toppled if it looked weak. They were still being told by an invasive power how their lives would be run. He quotes, "The kulaks were fine with the Soviet system until Stalin started collectivization out of necessity for more food." "I want to double down on the point I was making, though. Is all this really worth it for your system?" He quotes. No. Because it wouldn't happen again. Capitalism is more developed now, so anything like Stalin would be unnecessary. But, okay, another interjection. But isn't communism... Didn't Marx mention communism as some great thing? Like with pretty much no negatives? Like no downsides? Why did you have to go through this in the first place? Who's to say it won't happen again? Until you have complete fucking world domination. And, well, a lot of discord, quite frankly. I need to stop cursing. Sorry. Back to the narration. Now I'm going to say Stalin was some ideal. Now I'm not going to say Stalin was some ideal to follow, but we can especially learn from him and not repeat what he needed to do. But those capitalist countries didn't go socialist, did they? There wasn't reason for them to, besides in nations where other factors had left the government unstable, such as almost Germany, though that didn't quite pan out. Who was Russia at risk from? No German threat rose for years, and Stalin was rather blindsided by it when it did. Poland? They were a threat, but not an existential one. Finland, same deal. The only potential real threat I can think of would be Japan. The food was exported, not distributed. Stalin did only part of what he did out of a perceived necessity, quote unquote. And frankly, I think whatever cause everything he did ends up being necessary for, it better be the most important cause a human being has ever taken up. The Soviets used the kulak label liberally for anyone who did not submit their farm to collectivization. It was a buzzword. Who was Russia at risk from? No, Germany rose for years, and Stalin was rather blindsided when it did. Poland, Japan, etc. He quotes, "Not just the borders. Japan was one, and the UK, US, France, etc. had all intervened militarily against the Bolsheviks in the Civil War. There was a genuine fear that it would happen again. Food was exported to buy industrial equipment and distributed. About 3 million tons of grain was sent specifically to Ukraine and Kiev. The worst areas, along with also in other areas. The Soviets used the kulak label liberally. It was a buzzword," he quotes. Kulaks were a class in themselves. They used their land and their wealth to raise prices and put peasants under their economic domination during the NEP with Lenin. Even with all this, I think Stalin did a lot that was good, and again, there was a lot of freedoms that the normal narrative wouldn't necessarily talk about with the development of capitalism now. As socialists, with the development of capitalism now, as socialists, we don't have to worry about speedy industrialization or anything of the sort. We would be able to focus greater things away from foreign aggression. We can sit back and say that socialism is greater than capitalism without actually showing it. There are real kulaks for sure, though I'd argue their status is morally reprehensible, but not near everyone punished for being a kulak was one. Not in the slightest. I would argue that the vast majority of them were. I wouldn't believe you. The USSR also did itself no favors by infringing upon the sovereignty of her neighbor states on the regular, or in the case of Poland attempting to. The Western powers intervened in the Civil War because at the time the mission statement of the Reds was to spread their revolution to them. Okay, let's narrow this dramatically. Yes? Okay. Topic, is the employment relationship exploitative? You touched it a little, but it's a good apple of discord to focus on. It's simple ethical question, not based in squabbling over factual claims about the USSR. It's a simple ethical question, not based in squabbling over factual claims about the USSR. Honestly, I didn't have a massive desire to go into that extensively, the USSR shit. Yeah, same. I'd say yes in most cases. I think I need to go to bed too. I woke up super early today. My eyes are burning. Yeah, I'm yeah, we don't want to be focused today, sorry. I would say not inherently. And in those cases that it is, there are outs provided by the system. I'm also willing to pause for the evening if that's what you're implying. Fucking pause. Yeah, I think that's what we should do. Where the fuck? Because I want to come back to this, but I'm really tired. I could keep going, but I'm not going to force you to take an L over that shit. If at all possible. Shrug. Well, this was a colossal failure. What? Too pissed off at Zayla to give a shit. I award neither of you wins or poopy buttheads. Fuck off!